It's great to welcome Mark Milke of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy once again to this program. We first met on this podcast when we discussed his wonderful collection of essays, which he edited and the Aristotle Foundation published, titled The 1867 Project: Why Canada Should Be Cherished and Not Cancelled. And I imagine that the recent column that Mark presented to us has something to do with that vein, is titled Criminalizing Residential School Denialism in quotes, would silence Indigenous voices too. Mark, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks for having me on, John.
Yeah, so tell me a bit about the reception that the 1867 project has received so far.
Really well, and thanks for bringing it up. So we released that just over a year ago, and it went viral pretty much immediately and got to the top of the Amazon list in Canada to number one, stayed there for a week. It's been a bestseller ever since. A bestseller in Canada is often considered 5,000 books, or used to be when people bought more books, and it's sold almost 11,000 books now. So copies. So it's been a terrific. There's been a terrific reception, and I think in part because there's 20 authors, me and 19 other authors in this book, the 1867 Project, and I just, as it turns out, people like the fact we did some research on Canada, tried to add some nuance, gave some thoughtful commentary as to where it is in the future. And I'm not a big fan of the word diversity because it's been overused these days, even though it has its place. The best way to think about the authors in the 1867 project is they're all distinct. We've got everyone from a fellow from India telling Canada not to beat up on itself, um, to historians, to data guys like Matthew Lowett of Toronto, who says, look, institutional racism was worked on 70 years ago, and you see some personal prejudice today, as you do in any society. But that's not the same thing as thinking Canada in 2024 is akin to Alabama in 1924. So there's been a great reception because of, I think, the thoughtful chapters in the 1867 project. So thanks for bringing that up and flogging it.
Okay, and I would imagine that the essay collection also contains certain chapters in regards to Indigenous history in Canada and residential school, the topic of which is covered in your column. But let's move to the present and tell me about the recent proposed Bill C-413. So I imagine this is a proposed federal law, and so tell me
Yeah.
what does this law entail, and what is the implication if there is any?
Sure. Well, Member of Parliament Lee Aza has proposed this bill or introduced this bill, and it's an attempt to say, look, if you in any way don't really take the view that residential schools in Canada, where Indigenous peoples, what used to be called Treaty Indians or others, were in these schools, up until the 1990s, really. The last one, I think, closed in 1996. If you don't take the views that these were genocidal, then you're a denialist. In other words, she doesn't want to hear any nuance. So I wrote the column pointing out that over the decades, you've had Indigenous Canadians, and I mentioned this in the National Post column, and people can look it up online or on our website at aristotlefoundation.org. I give three examples of Native Canadians who, over the years, have said, look, there were some positive experiences in these schools. Now, the moment you say that, some people will light their hair on fire and say you're denying this or that, or the physical and sexual abuse that happened. No, not for a moment. And one must think about why that happened because I think it has resonance even today. Well, the problem of a remote location and the danger that that poses, whether it's a school or frankly, whether it's a reserve controlled by, one family on reserve or a chief and what that does in terms of the power structure. I'm a political scientist. I think about the potential abuses of power and how that can be, how that's activated and how it can be addressed. So, but the moment you say there's any nuance on residential schools, so for example, let me read you something, Sean, from the column. Rita Galloway in 1988 is interviewed. She's from the Pelican Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan, also then president of the First Nations Accountability Coalition. She's interviewed about residential schools, and she has this to say. She had many friends and relatives who attended residential schools, and she goes on to say, of course, there were good and bad elements, but overall, their experiences were positive, unquote. The late Richard Wagamese, a famous Native Canadian journalist who wrote in the Calgary Herald 10 years later in 2008 that many abuses took place. He wasn't in denial about that. But he said his mother went there, and that story needed to be told as well. And then he tells the story of his mother. At that point, she's 75. She's living by Kenora, Ontario, on a reserve just outside of Kenora. And Waigames noted how his mother credits the residential school for teaching her domestic skills. And he talks about how, she had this wonderfully, curated lawn. She was very neat, and she credits her domestic skills, which seems old-fashioned, but kids need to learn things somewhere, with teaching her these skills and other skills. And he says, in quote, "My mother has never spoken to me of abuse or any catastrophic experience at the school." And he finishes this column back in 2008 by saying that then Truth and Reconciliation Commission should listen to these good stories, hear these good stories, seek them out, needs to hear these kinds of stories too, unquote. And then he goes on to say, the good along with the bad will create a more balanced future for all of us. So those are two examples, and I can give another one in a moment. But the point of it is lived experiences, as people like to say it these days. You want to hear all of them. It's a bit of a cliche, lived experiences, but nonetheless, these are real histories from people that attended these schools. Now, it doesn't mean in the main they were desirable, but that assumes a perfect world. And we should go back 100 years or 150 years and ask what the alternative was. Progressives and everyone else a century ago believed in universal education. This was something that came a cropper in the mid 19th century, where the goal was to make sure every kid had universal education. You mentioned the 1867 project. In that book, there's a chapter by former NDP MP Lynn MacDonald, who talks about the introduction of universal education in Canada in the mid 19th century. So that's the goal in the mid 19th century in Canada for everyone, including Indigenous children. Now ask yourself how you could possibly have educated every child in Canada, or tried to, if you didn't have schools in the middle of nowhere, i.e. on a remote reserve. And that's problematic. You couldn't set up a day school on reserve, necessarily on every reserve in the country in a remote location. And boarding schools were just common in the British Empire and in other countries, unfortunately. Now, that's a problem because it creates a problem for abuse. But again, there's lots of nuance, and I'm no expert in residential schools. I do claim to be an expert in having read everything the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wrote. And there was some very informative material there, but I would also say they had a bit of a bias against nuance, against understanding the choices available at the time. And if you say something like everyone should have had a day school in 1893 or 1920 or whatever it was, that's not realistic. And imagine if a past generation of Canadians back then had not chosen to try and educate Indigenous children somehow, even through a faulty mechanism like residential schools, a non-perfect mechanism. And we don't live in a perfect world, never have, never will. Imagine if they'd simply said, too far away from, say Winnipeg, we're not going to set up any schools in remote areas. We're not going to do it. And assume they were forced, they with foresight could potentially see some, negatives in these schools. Today, I'm sure you would hear from some of the same voices who decry any nuance in residential schools like Leah Gowson. Today, you would hear that somehow we were racist or not interested in helping Indigenous Canadians precisely because we didn't try and educate every child, including in very remote locations. So I think people have to understand it was a choice in the last 150, 200 years between two suboptimal choices, not ideal choices. And that's often what you face in life and in politics and in education. Not perfect choices, not two perfect choices, but suboptimal choices. Long answer to a short question, Sean.
I see. Yeah. And as a Catholic and as a former temporary resident of your great country of Canada, the issue of residential schools and, of course, Indigenous history concerns me a lot because I believe there was the story about the mass grave scandal, which obviously, as of today, is turned out to be just a pile of hot air. And the news of that reaches the Vatican, and Pope Francis issued an apology for the school system, which of course, the Catholic Church had something to do with it. Of course, they set up a fair number of schools for Indigenous people in that country. So I wonder, is such an apology from the pontiff or any authority necessary?
Well, I suppose people can do what they want, including the pontiff. My concern is that apologies give the wrong sheen. In essence, personal apologies matter, is kind of my thing. I think if you do something as an individual that's wrong, you should apologize for it. I'm not sure apologies on behalf of the collective are all that useful, and I'm not sure it'll stop an abuse the next time. So I'm not sure it's a good idea to apologize for people in history, as if somehow we were responsible for their actions, which really is a bizarre claim because my skin color looks like someone did something bad in history, or you know, I mean, or your ancestors might have done something bad. You should apologize for them because they're your ancestors. I mean, how does that solve anything? So I'm not a big fan of them. If they make people feel better, if they feel like some horrible truth is being acknowledged, I suppose there could be some use to it. But I and political. So I'm just not a big fan of it. Also, as well, again, it removes nuance. If you're apologizing for the entire residential school system, tell me what else you would have done 100 years ago. And it ignores current problems. Let me give you a great example of that, because I think the problem with residential schools historically is not always exactly what they've been portrayed as, or the problem's been portrayed to be, which is simply their existence. You have to go deeper than that because then you can prevent future abuses. And again, boarding school as opposed to what 120 years ago in a remote location. There was a great column in the New York Times by a columnist in 2015. I forget his name in the moment, but he wrote a great column, and it was about a scandal that had been uncovered or finally blew open in the United Kingdom. And it was about how the cops were ignoring rapes and abuse of young English girls, teenagers, because they were lower class, and apparently they were mainly abused by a local community of Pakistani men. Nobody wanted to talk about this open, and the cops didn't want to do anything because they didn't want to be accused of being anti-immigrant or anti-Pakistani men. This finally blew open, and this New York Times columnist looked at this and said, "You know why this happened?" He said, "Whenever you sacralize something, um, that's where you're going to find the next abuse because you can't question it, can't talk about it, you can't criticize the people involved in it." And he gave the examples of Catholic priests, right? For the longest time, I'm a Protestant, but the same thing applies. You couldn't criticize pastors. In the Catholic Church, no one would dare criticize a priest for the longest time until some of this started to crack open in the 1980s and 1990s, I believe. And he made an excellent point, this New York Times columnist, that if you want to, find out where the next abuses are going to occur, find out, what you're not supposed to talk about these days openly. And when I think about reserves these days, we used to have some conversations about reserves across this country and reform, starting with Pierre Trudeau and others, and he was, pilloried for it. But when you think about, a reserve in the middle of nowhere with a male chief who controls the budget. The money comes top down to people on reserve, that sort of thing, controls housing, who's going to get housing, who's going to get repairs. It's a recipe for abuse. And I wrote about this actually in another book, The Victim Cult, where I pointed out that, look, there's horrific sexual abuse on reserves. And we know this from some of the reporting. We know this from some of the stories. And it's almost never talked about publicly these days. Why? Because we've sacralized reserves. And again, I understand historically why they came up, and there's more to that than people understand. Historically, in some cases, First Nations chiefs said, look, some of the white guys nearby are starting to buy up all the land. They went to the pre-Dominion government and said, you need to create some reserves. This was the case in Ontario to protect our community. And it was well-meaning. In other cases, it was racist. Some people wanted to put Indians in quotes, on reserve and keep them from the rest of the population. So both of those things were in play depending on the reserve. But what has that done? It's created, I think, a potential for great corruption. Not I think it's pretty demonstrable. It's created the potential for corruption because of the top-down system, federal government money to reserves and down. It's created potential for abuse because of the power of some chiefs on some reserves. I'm not, taking everybody in, putting everybody in that category. But I think that's what people miss when they want to blame something on residential schools. It was the model of something in the middle of nowhere with someone who had, extreme control, i.e., a principal or a teacher. That's why some of the abuses happened. They didn't happen everywhere. And again, back to where we started, some of the Indigenous Canadians who I quoted in my column in the National Post and quoted here, um, that's why abuse, there was some good, but that's why some of the abuses happened because of the structure. And if people don't think about the structure, they're going to find someone, not you and me, 60 years from now, will have the same conversation about why the abuses on reserves were ignored. And they'll have to look back to the historical record and say, well, in that generation, we're so focused on the past as opposed to the present and what was happening then. And they hadn't learned the lesson from residential schools and why the abuses occurred. And they didn't want to touch or talk about current problems on reserves and some of the abuse that happens today. So if people don't understand why things happen, and that's back to Leah Gazin and her bill to criminalize, in essence, to criminalize discussion about this. That's unhelpful and it's harmful and it will lead to more abuse.
Yes. So as far as I can tap into the conversation in regards to residential schools in Canada, I often hear this narrative that says, well, it's not just the abuse that we are concerned about, it's the purpose of why these schools were established in the first place, uh, to exemplify one such as a detractor from your column. Um, they would say that the very purpose of starting these schools is to quote unquote educate the Indian out of the child, so to make the
Right.
child
Or more
hospitable
harsh words. Yeah, in some
to
cases. Yeah.
white society or something by
Yeah.
teaching him things that are far from his Indian or indigenous cultural heritage.
Right.
And I wonder, do these indigenous voices that you featured in the column, do they provide a counterweight to this version of the narrative?
Well, perhaps. I mean, they didn't go into that, I think, in the interviews that I scanned. But the problem with this cultural puritanism, as I call it, is its belief in the pure culture will save you, and it won't, right? Whether it's indigenous people or any other culture. There's nothing wrong with valuing your culture for the most part, unless you're Chairman Mao, or Adolf Hitler, and you're glorifying, an extreme version of your culture. Um, there's nothing wrong with appreciating one's culture and the culture of others. And in fact, the most successful cultures and the most successful civilizations in history have been those that have borrowed from other cultures, right? If in the West we were still using Roman numerals, we wouldn't have, been able to develop, insurance or anything else that takes, complex calculations, and you can go throughout history. Japan closed itself off from the world for 2.5 centuries. By the time it opened up or was forced to open up, it was relatively weak. Um, so cultural purity is fine, I suppose, except that it's actually the intermixing of cultures that can make a nation or a civilization stronger. And you can learn things from other people. But now we've got a reaction, and I understand it. If you've been colonialized, but almost every culture and ethnicity in history has, if you go back far enough, if you think you've been oppressed, then you're going to say, well, I'd like my culture to kind of be preserved. Fine, but let's not romanticize it. I mean, my background's German, but I wouldn't romanticize German culture in the last 2 centuries. Um, Germans had the same reaction. And I wrote about this in The Victim Cult, which we're going to re-release this fall, by the way, or early next year. But in The Victim Cult, I talked about the experience in Germany, occupied by France, late 18th century, early 19th century. They expelled France from southern and western Germany. And Germans are searching for their identity, trying to renew their identity because they've been oppressed and beat up by the French. So what do? They fall down this rabbit hole of pure culture, which means you have to be born there, you have to be Protestant Christian, you can't be Jewish. They don't like British liberals, for example, and open markets. They've got these things that they glom onto as Germans. And this happened a century or 80, 90 years before they really even got in the pure race. And people are aware of the damage that notion did. So this notion of pure culture is what people get to. I mean, look, nobody should have told kids in residential schools or anywhere else not to appreciate their culture or not learn about it. But again, from what reading I have done, that was not universally true. It happened in some schools, not others. And so again, here's the problem with a bill that criminalizes any thinking and talking about residential schools as if it was simplistic. and simple, is that you're not going to get nuances and you're not going to get, yeah, but, arguments. So yeah, I mean, there were some, in some cases, yes, these schools were designed to, you know, make people what? Good little, kids in the British classical liberal tradition and white. There was racism there in some cases. So yes, that's a problem. But again, show me a perfect country or civilization in history. On the other hand, what did the British bring? Right? Well, they brought an abolitionist effort, which no other civilization in history had done to that point. The British were trying to wipe out slavery, for example, in British Columbia, pre and post Confederation, while some First Nations in British Columbia, including the Haida, still kept slaves. So again, here's something that's rare these days, nuance. There were some good aspects to the British Empire and colonialism, and insofar, as it repressed some cultures, as modern day, liberals or small c conservatives who take a liberal predisposition, we're not crazy about that sort of thing. But I wouldn't overstate it either. I mean, there's a great story in a new book, and I forget the name, that just came out of British Columbia, and I've seen this work before. In 1858, there was a segment, I think 30 Black Californians that moved to Victoria, and then hundreds over the next several years. Why? Because they found Victoria tolerant compared to California and welcoming, right? Governor James Douglas had some indigenous blood in himself, I understand, or maybe it was his wife, I forget. But they welcomed Black Californians and they became citizens quickly, could vote, run for the school board, this sort of thing, attend the Anglican Church without any discrimination. So people forget that, it's not like the British were all bad and indigenous peoples were all pure. I mean, that's a myth as well. There's a famous line from Alexander Solzhenitsyn that the dividing line between good and evil runs through each one of us. And so, again, without the extreme versions in history, Chairman Mao, Pol Pot, Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and others, most countries and people have something to recommend, something about them. And there's some that are more preferable to others. I mean, you're aware of Hong Kong. These days, there's a lot of people in Hong Kong who would love British liberties, and they've been losing them because of the regime in Beijing, which is repressive. And one day, I hope the rest of China becomes much, much more like Hong Kong was until recently, and not the reverse. Because if you care about ideas and not skin color or ethnicities, then again, you'll look to other cultures and say, okay, I like mine, I appreciate mine. What can I borrow from another civilization that may improve ours?
Yes, yes, of course. And I think I have the same view in regards to my own religion, which is Catholicism, which is there are great ideas from other world religions, but I happen to find this one to be homely.
And that's perfectly legitimate. We live in an age where nobody likes to make distinctions, right? They think, we should believe in the moral equality of individuals, which is a very actually Christian notion. Um, and that's one of the reasons the abolitionist movement arose, because it believed in the moral equality of individuals. It doesn't mean you have to believe in the equality of every idea. I prefer monogamy to polygamy. I think it's better for women. There are some ideas that are better than others, but people don't like to think about these days, much less say that out loud. It's one of the reasons we founded the Aristotle Foundation, is to say to people, think, like have some debate. You don't have to be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian. I default to that, but I think we don't, especially in Canada. I'm not sure if it's as much of a problem around the rest of the world, but certainly in Canada, we have this reputation for being nice, but sometimes that means we don't think or say things out loud that we are thinking. So one of the reasons we founded the Aristotle Foundation was to try and say to people, listen, if you really want to solve problems, you better be correct about the cause of that problem. And so again, the residential schools are a great example. The attempt to teach kids was good. Was it flawed? Yeah, but again, what was your alternative 100 years ago? And if you wonder why abuse happened on residential schools, it's the same reason abuse happens on reserves today. Remote, middle of nowhere in some cases, and a power-hungry chief who will say to some lady, if you want your 3 kids to have an education or repairs to your home, sleep with me. This is not unknown in the history of the world, this kind of power abuse. So, and it's not just on reserves. I mean, it happens in Hollywood, like in Harvey Weinstein, right? If you want that job, see my casting couch over there. So we need to stop being romantic about people, men and women in human history and now, and also acknowledge the limited choices some of them faced as well. I think that would go a long way towards restoring a sense of, okay, how do we solve an actual problem today? First we have to learn what went wrong in history.
Yes, and of course, I certainly appreciate that the Aristotle Foundation exists, and I appreciate the extent of the involvement I have, working with you guys.
Yes, well, thank you, Chung, and thank you for your columns. We'll have to get more of those over time.
Yes, I hope so too. And I'd like to conclude by saying, well, one, I would love to discuss your book, The Victim Cult, when it is released next year. And secondly, think to close up our discussion on this topic, what do you believe genuine truth and reconciliation in regards to, Indigenous history
Hmm.
such look like?
Well, that's a good question. I think in part I think there has to be truth all around. That's why you don't want to criminalize dissent like Leah Gadsden's bill is attempting to do. Um, Look, I think there's been a lot of attempts at reconciliation. I don't think they're recognized. About 12 years ago now, 11 years ago, I wrote a paper for the Fraser Institute detailing the kind of spending on Aboriginal Canadians, as we then called them, Indigenous Canadians today, that has gone on since in the post-war world. I literally traced back the statistics to 1945, and there was a lot of money, and the spending over the decades, provincially and federally, way zoomed past inflation. Inflation increases per capita. Now, I wrote this paper, and I also pointed out in the paper the other spending that did not have to be done, that wasn't treaty required, constitution required. I made these points in that paper in part to say, listen, a lot of money has been spent. It's not like Canadians haven't tried to, make up if you can do that for past wrongs or try and address these problems through money. So I think that needs to be acknowledged, frankly, by some of the First Nations leaders that haven't. Um, it can't be just about money. It better be about how you figure out what has gone wrong in the past, like I said, and what is leading to abuses today. And I think, look, I'm a classic liberal in this sense. I think individuals ultimately ought to be treated as individuals, not as part of some collective. I don't care about someone's ethnicity or where they were born, or if they're First Nations or non, that sort of thing. I think individuals in law and policy should be treated as individuals in law and policy because one may reject one's heritage. I don't have to have any appreciation for German, philosophical thought in the 19th century, which is pretty nationalistic in the wrong way, pretty narrow-minded. I reject that. You don't have to accept everything your culture, um, from your culture that you came to the world into with. So, look, I think the individual should be the focus of law and policy. Now, you have to make certain exceptions for treaties and constitutions, but ultimately, we know from the data that Indigenous Canadians are much more successful in cities, for example, not on reserve, because again, a lot of reserves are in the middle of nowhere, far from educational and career opportunities. So, I think the focus should be on the positive, really, in terms of reconciliation. But I'm not much for the ceremonies and the chatter. I'm not sure it does much. A good education and meeting other people that are different from yourself is probably the best way to succeed in life. Again, it's a bit like cultural sharing, right? Which some people call cultural appropriation. No, cultural sharing is a good thing because that's how you figure out who you are, what your priorities are, what you really believe, and you can learn from other cultures. Again, in my first example, look, the Europe and the rest of the West and the rest of the world, if we hadn't adopted Arabic numbering, we'd still be scratching stuff on walls, and wouldn't have developed engineering and everything else. So it pays to borrow.
Yeah. And on that wonderful note, thank you very much, Mark Milke, for joining the show.
Thank you, John.